On the night of April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck an iceberg. By 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, it had already vanished beneath the North Atlantic. In less than 3 hours, the most luxurious and self-assured ship of its time became a symbol of tragedy, taking more than 1,500 lives with it. But what almost no one stops to consider is that the Titanic may not have been defeated by an iceberg alone. It may have been doomed long before the collision ever happened. The Titanic was introduced to the world as a monument to progress. It was about 882 feet long, filled with lavish interiors, equipped with advanced technology for its era, and widely known as a practically unsinkable ship. Its construction cost $7.5 million at the time, the equivalent of an enormous fortune today, and required roughly 3,000 workers over about 26 months before the hull was launched. But this giant came into the world carrying a heavy cost in every sense. At least 8 workers died during construction. It was almost as if, even before its maiden voyage, the Titanic was already carrying a shadow over it. And maybe that is the first secret that makes this story so fascinating. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was a symbol. And when a symbol has to look perfect, flaws stop being treated like flaws and start being hidden, minimized, or ignored. That same atmosphere of overconfidence followed the ship all the way to the night of the disaster. When the Titanic set sail, many people believed they were boarding the safest ship in the world. And there is one technical detail that helps explain why that reputation grew so strong. It had 16 main watertight compartments and could, in theory, stay afloat if up to 4 were flooded. The problem is that after the collision, at least 5 compartments were breached. That was enough to shatter the illusion of invulnerability. In other words, the moment reality exceeded the limits of the design, the unsinkable ship became impossible to save. But the iceberg did not appear out of nowhere like a bolt from the blue. The Titanic received multiple ice warnings throughout April 14th. Even so, it kept moving at high speed through dangerous waters. Studies and timelines of the disaster show the ship traveling at around 22 knots, which helps explain why, when the iceberg was finally spotted, there was almost no time left to react. That detail changes the entire way you see the tragedy. The problem was not just finding the ice, but finding it too fast, too late, and with far too much confidence. And that is where one of the most famous and unsettling details of the whole story comes in. The lookouts had no binoculars in the crow's nest. Historical sources report that the binoculars had been misplaced or were otherwise inaccessible, and Britannica itself notes that they were missing that night. At the same time, the sea was unusually calm, which made spotting an iceberg even harder, because there were no waves breaking at its base to reveal it in the dark. The result, by the time the warning came, there was no time left. But now comes the part that makes a lot of people raise an eyebrow. There is a theory that the iceberg alone does not explain everything. Some researchers argue that there had been a coal bunker fire burning for days or even weeks before the voyage, and that it may have weakened part of the hull. That theory gained attention through interpretations of old photographs showing a dark mark on the side of the ship. Supporters say the damaged area would have faced the open sea, and that the Titanic still sailed because of commercial pressure and the desire to avoid financial loss. But this is where it is important to separate fact from speculation. The theory exists and is debated, but the historical consensus still points to the iceberg collision as the central cause of the sinking. Either way, one thing is certain. When the impact happened, the Titanic was not prepared for an evacuation on the scale it would need. The ship carried 20 lifeboats, enough for about 1,178 people, a little more than half of those on board. And that was despite the fact that the ship could have carried far more. To make matters worse, a lifeboat drill scheduled for that same day was canceled, and many launches happened in a confused, improvised way, often with empty seats. In other words, even the limited chance of survival that existed was partly wasted because of chaos. That point becomes even more infuriating when you look at the class differences. Later investigations moved away from the simplistic idea that third-class passengers were literally locked below until the end, but they also made it clear that third class suffered disproportionately more. Their location on the ship, the difficulty of reaching the upper decks, the disorganization, and the social structure of the time all favored those who were already closer to the lifeboats. In practice, first and second class had a clear advantage, while third class paid the highest price. And as if that were not cruel enough, there was also the case of the Californian, the ship that became one of the most controversial parts of the story. The 1912 inquiries were sharply critical of its actions. Testimony and later analysis indicate that rockets were seen, signals were misread, and the response simply did not happen the way it should have. Even decades later, there is still debate about the exact distance and what might realistically have been done in time, but the lasting image is devastating. Potential help not far away, total confusion, and a disaster that might at least have been less deadly. And then comes the most brutal part of all, the water. The Atlantic that night was around 28 degrees, about 2 degrees C. For most of the people who ended up in the sea, death came within minutes through a combination of cold shock and hypothermia. That is why the Titanic was not just a shipwreck, it was also a mass death by freezing. And in the middle of that horror came stories that seem almost unbelievable, like that of head baker Charles Jaugen, who claimed he had been drinking whiskey and survived in the freezing water for an extraordinary amount of time. His account is real and became legendary, although historians still debate the exact details, and alcohol certainly was not some magical explanation. Another strange, almost surreal layer of the Titanic story appears in the small human details scattered throughout the ship. According to records gathered in books about the passengers, there were 13 honeymoon couples on board. There were also at least 12 dogs, and only 3 survived, all of them small enough to be carried discreetly into lifeboats. And then there were symbolic details about the ship itself, like the famous fourth funnel, which many people think was completely fake. In reality, it was mostly aesthetic, designed to make the ship look more impressive, but it also served a ventilation function. Even in that, the Titanic seemed determined to appear bigger, grander, and more powerful than it really needed to be. There is also the famous image of the musicians playing until the very end. It became part of the legend, and many survivors did report that the band continued playing to calm the passengers. What is not fully certain is how long they kept playing and what the final song actually was. Some accounts point to autumn, others to nearer, my God, to thee. So the core fact appears to be true. There was music in the middle of the chaos, but the final details remain wrapped in memory, trauma, and myth. And the tragedy did not end when the ship disappeared. Many bodies were never recovered. Ships sent to the site later retrieved hundreds, but some victims were buried at sea because there was not enough room or proper means to preserve all the dead. In one of those recovery operations, the Mackay Bennett recovered 306 bodies, and 116 were buried at sea. That makes the Titanic story even heavier because it left behind more than a wreck on the ocean floor. It also left a graveyard scattered across the Atlantic. And even more than 7 decades later, the Titanic was still keeping another secret. It was not found until September 1st, 1985, about 12,500 feet below the surface, in 2 large sections with a field of debris spread around them. In other words, for 73 years, the most famous ship in the world lay invisible, silent, and broken on the ocean floor, fueling mysteries, legends, and theories. The wreck was not preserved the way many people had imagined. It was split apart, which helped confirm that its final moments were even more violent than the public had long believed. And this is where the most controversial theory of all comes in. The idea that the ship that sank was not actually the Titanic, but the Olympic disguised as it in an alleged insurance fraud scheme. That story still circulates today because it is dramatic, cinematic, and full of tempting coincidences. The problem is that experts overwhelmingly reject it. Britannica notes that artifacts recovered from the wreck carry the Titanic's yard number, and history points out major flaws in the economic and practical logic behind the theory. In short, it is a famous conspiracy, but not a serious explanation for the disaster. In the end, maybe this is the Titanic's real secret. It did not sink just because of an iceberg. It sank because of a brutal chain of overconfidence, speed, ignored warnings, social inequality, a chaotic evacuation, too few lifeboats, and decisions that seemed small until they became fatal. The iceberg was real, but it struck a ship that was already vulnerable because of the arrogance of its own era. And maybe that is exactly why this story still haunts us more than a century later. And the deeper you dive into the Titanic story, the more you realize the disaster was not only maritime, it was human. It was technical, it was social, it was psychological, and it was also a brutal lesson in what happens when confidence outruns caution. So if you enjoy videos like this, full of little-known facts, mysteries, and details most people overlook, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the most famous story in the world is still hiding its darkest parts in plain sight.